Hey folks, welcome back to the StoreHero podcast. Karl O'Brien and Thomas Gleeson here, co-founders of StoreHero. Couple of interesting weeks, plenty to keep us busy. One piece maybe we can start by giving people a little bit of an update on, Thomas, is some new features. So two big pieces we've launched on the StoreHero platform in the last couple of weeks. One is Klaviyo. So as StoreHero users will have seen over the last week or so, they can actually get a clear view of their Klaviyo flows and campaigns. Something that sometimes seems like Klaviyo doesn't want to wants to get in people's way to a certain extent. And the analytics side has always been something that maybe hasn't been as much of a strong suit. How have you found clients have reacted to it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for Klaviyo and the size of the company, it is, and the revenue that they generate. I think they've just IPO'd recently. The UI and the analytics in the platform has been notoriously not fantastic, I suppose, to uh, to treat it well, I suppose. Yeah, we've launched a lot more features, I suppose, within the Klaviyo dashboard and give it a nice, much more simpler UI. And really, I suppose, double down. You can see now your unsubscribe rates by your campaign and also by flow to indicate, I suppose, is there certain campaigns or flow that are maybe contributing negatively to the overall performance of the Klaviyo account, and obviously that more important new spam rate feature that obviously is incredibly more important now since 1st of February, more so now than ever.
Definitely, just to speak to that a little bit more, ultimately, all the updates and the requests and requirements you might have had from yourself or your team, or you're getting emails about all these extra kind of DNS records you need to add. The practical implication of that is Google wants to, improve the quality of email in the inbox, and all providers in line with that. That means by setting those up, people can less kind of likely pose as your domain name. So it is good, but it is another thing on the to-do list over the last couple of weeks and months. One big component they're looking at is making sure that brands can keep their spam rate down as low as possible. So ultimately, the benchmark that they're using is you need to keep your spam rate lower than a 0.3, so 0.3% spam rate in any given week or month. So that's
So
particularly important. And maybe you can speak to that, Thomas. Yeah.
so just to even let people know, like, so if, for instance, you're a brand and your spam rates are now over 0.3, what's going to happen?
Ultimately, from Google's perspective, it's what they're saying is going to happen and what will actually happen are probably potentially two different things. But they're certainly indicating that your domain will be demoted heavily. And what that ultimately means is you're going to end up in that spam filter much more. So what we've seen with users of StoreHero over the last couple of weeks now having that spam filter, whether it's pinned to the dashboard or even just accessible within the Klaviyo screen, is it's a very clear indication, am I getting anywhere close to that? And therefore, should I start to change my email behavior as well? Maybe just to expand on that, one other feature we've launched in the last couple of weeks is LTV. It's definitely a big focus that we've had over the last couple of months from a development perspective, and certainly a popular request we've gotten from brands. And I suppose a big piece, maybe you can speak to this, Thomas, is ultimately why we waited to actually launch that feature. And a critical piece is maybe around how people calculate LTV on either a total sales or a gross basis.
Yeah, I mean, anyone working in this industry and probably listening to this podcast, probably all have a different metric or definition as to what LTV actually means. Um, getting this metric right can be a huge unlock for your brand. Getting it wrong can kill your brand and leave you end up in hot water very, very quickly. There's so many different ways to, I suppose, spin it and define it and kind of build your kind of overarching financial forecast based in the back of it. One thing to make sure, I suppose, broad stroke, that you're not doing when you're calculating LTV is just calculating top line revenue. Because if you're building out your CAC to LTV models and you're saying, okay, we can acquire a customer for €50 because our LTV is 200, and that 200 is actually just straight revenue, your customer lifetime value is definitely not 200. You need to make sure that you're calculating that very, very correctly. So making sure that you're kind of getting to a point where you're calculating it on a gross level, you're excluding the VAT, you're excluding all the product and all the variable costs that kind of go with that. So if we're looking at one simple product and just take it to €100 and we want to strip out the VAT, in Ireland that's 23%, then you want to strip out all the product costs, you want to strip out your fulfillment costs, your transaction fees, your shipping costs, and what's left, that's your gross LTV on the first purchase. And just making sure that that's the way you're looking to calculate LTV, I suppose, that you're really looking at it on a gross level, excluding all the variable costs. Because if you're looking at it on a straight revenue basis, again, that is not a true reflection on what your LTV is. So I suppose the reason we delayed in maybe building LTV initially was we wanted to make sure that we had I suppose, the capabilities in the platform to make sure that we had the ability to pipe in all of those variable costs. So obviously that's in place now. So all of your Shopify costs will pull directly into StoreHero, along with any transaction fees, shipping costs, fulfillment costs, any other additional costs that might scale as you look to scale your business. They'll obviously all be pulled into the LTV calculation that we've built now.
Definitely, and I suppose just to pull that back into perspective for brands, ultimately that LTV screen will now tell you what's the actual profit you've actually earned or generated from customers over a specific period of time. So one popular kind of filter you might want to look at is, okay, let's look at all the customers I've acquired in November 2023, and what was the total profit I've generated in the couple of months since then? Have those people hung around? Have they repurchased? At what percentage over the following 30, 60, 90, 120 days since the last purchase? And it can be really important there. For example, let's say you want to be maybe not even, you may want to be first order profitable. You want to cover the cost of acquiring that customer on the first sale. Maybe you have a little bit more flexibility and you'll say, well, I want to make sure that maybe within the following 2 months, I recoup that investment I've made in that customer. So if you look at that 120-day LTV, it'll tell you what's the profit I made off my customers in this time period in the first 120 days of them being a customer. So therefore, if that number is actually higher or lower than your customer acquisition cost, you can make some decisions. If that number is higher, that means that, okay, 120 days post-purchase, that customer acquisition cost is paid for, and therefore we're into a much more profitable perspective, potentially using Klaviyo to pick up some of that heavy lifting, and potentially, alternatively, if it's not a case that you're actually seeing that profit yet, okay, well then it's going to take a bit longer than those 120 days.
We could probably do a full episode series on this,
I was
and I'm
going to
sure
say
we will.
we better hold it there. A couple of other updates before we dive in to the episode. Ultimately, we'd had a really exciting update, even ourselves, in the last probably about 2 months ago now. We kind of got word of it, but we were able to now talk about it, which is StoreHero has been accepted into the NDRC Accelerator Program. So for anyone who's not familiar with the program, think about it like a kind of a Y Combinator model, or a startup accelerator program specifically for the Irish markets. So one thing that they've done is actually held back the announcement until we're a couple of weeks into the program, which has been great because actually now that we have a chance to talk about it, we can actually talk about it a little bit more substantively. So Thomas, maybe you can kick off. How have you found the program so far?
Incredible. To be honest with you, I had really, really high expectations of it, and it's definitely exceeded them. I mean, as a young startup, we've been able to get in front of people that, let's be honest, we probably wouldn't have a chance of getting in front of, and kind of get some really valuable one-to-one coaching on all aspects of the business, from product to kind of, I suppose, hiring to marketing, content marketing. Some of the people we've got in front of, I suppose, have been incredible and really offered some really valuable insights blending from their own experience. A lot of them are kind of ex founders of large companies who might have exited in the tech industry, and kind of thinking about how they balanced approach to maybe hiring, to internationalization, to how to fundraise properly, when not to fundraise, and all that kind of thing. So some really, really interesting nuances and experience and that kind of thing. So no, I found it incredible, to be honest.
Definitely. And I think, so as all the core components we're running through on the program reinforces the fact that ultimately we're building a business at the end of the day. We're building a startup. We're building a platform we think is really going to help brands. And potentially we're actually running into some of the same daily challenges and stresses and ups and downs that actual e-commerce store owners are themselves. So we understand those dynamics. And yeah, this is keeping us very front of mind. I think it's definitely elevated and kind of widened our ambition to maybe put as broad strokes to give a quick summary of it. So probably not everything we can update people on today, but I'm sure we'll have a couple of updates in the next couple of months.
Definitely keeps you accountable as well. Like, for context, I suppose we're in a cohort with maybe 5 other businesses, I think. So we kind of have like a check-in on a Monday and a Friday. Really interesting, because you kind of set out your goals on a Monday of what you want to do, and then you have that call on Friday evening, and obviously everybody wants to make sure you're checking off everything that you had set on a Monday. So I found that brilliant, and it's always interesting to hear what other businesses are working on at different stages as well.
Definitely, and that accountability piece is so important. What many e-commerce store owners, agency owners, and even kind of startup founders, to whatever extent, are faced with, that they potentially don't always have someone on their shoulder keeping them accountable. But at the end of the day, it'll catch up with you if you don't stay accountable, and you're maybe sacrificing your potential for growth. So again, plenty of teams I'm sure we'll touch on. One last update before we kick on is the events. So we have a number of events running in both Dublin and Galway, and we're recording this in mid-February. So if you're listening back to this, it might not be as relevant, but on the 21st and 22nd of February 2024, we have a couple of events. Maybe, Thomas, you can give some context on those.
Yeah, yeah, we've kind of called the event Ecom Pulse, Adapt, Profit, Thrive, and we're partnering with Shopbox AI, which is another fantastic Shopify tool in the Irish ecosystem, and also with Cubics, a Shopify Plus agency as well. So I suppose what's the idea with the event? We're trying to create a good community nationwide, and hopefully we're bringing this internationally to the UK and to the US later in the year. A really good community of ecom founders, agency owners, and SaaS providers to really kind of get together in somewhat of a regular cadence. We try to really steer away from, I know we've all probably been to the ecom events and you kind of walk in and it's a Trojan horse and it's a SaaS sales pitch to some extent. We've made a really deliberate attempt to not have that there and really have people try and walk away thinking, you know what, that I actually learned something there. That was really, really useful. So we kind of kicked off with the first event in Cork 2 weeks ago, I think it was, depending on when you're listening to this. I think it was early February. And we had, 31st of January, we had James Kelly, really, really great speaker, really, really interesting story. I'm sure we'll probably get him on here at some stage. We had Kieran O'Brien from Core Optimization, and then we also had Declan O'Keefe from Dex Pets as well. So 3 really, really brilliant speakers, I suppose. And we kind of did a bit of a merchant roundtable, kind of just chatting around trends, what they saw for the year, their problems and opportunities. Yeah, everyone shared some really, really interesting insights, and I think everybody that was there got a lot from it. So in terms of the Dublin event that we're kicking off with in 2 weeks' time, so we have Peter Kerwin, who is the head of digital for Louis Copeland. We've Adam Kitchen, retention king on Klaviyo. We also have the managing director from Oriana B, and then we also have James from Fairley, of course, in there as well. So really looking forward to seeing that event kind of kick off as well.
Definitely, yeah, that's on the 21st and 22nd of February for anyone interested. So, perfect. Look, we'll dive in. We've given our updates. From our side, there's a couple of things we really wanted to go deep on, as myself and Thomas were trying to figure out what is the key piece of content and value we can try to give people this week. And I suppose what we want to touch on is the overarching problem with ROAS. So, ROAS, as anyone who's familiar, is going to be your return on ad spend, a metric that most people will set as the holy grail for their e-commerce performance from a marketing and sales perspective. Now, that doesn't tell the full picture. And I suppose before we dive in there, we need to kind of take a step back and speak to why that is and ultimately what's the lay of the land from an e-commerce side today. So I suppose the biggest question we often get when we're speaking to brands is, how can I grow my business profitably? And that last word is obviously the key piece there. Ultimately, the economic environment that has existed for the last couple of years with cheap capital and excess opportunity and options for people meant that people had an option to maybe was a grow at all cost, but grow at more cost than they can today, let's say. So really, I think the key focus for anyone we're speaking to is having that profitability front of mind. And I suppose, Thomas, from your perspective, it's, over the last couple of years, I know you saw in Shopify, it's been easy to start an e-commerce business, but it's tougher to actually do so while remaining profitable.
Definitely. I mean, look, Shopify massively. I mean, we had Kieran Crean from Mixed Garage on recently. Started off as a software engineer, and you kind of needed to be a software engineer to some extent to run an e-commerce business 20 years ago. I think Shopify have done an exceptional job in really allowing anyone to create an e-commerce business without needing to be a wizard or a developer from that perspective. So I suppose it's lowered the technical bar for anybody to get started and run an e-commerce business. And then I suppose Google and Facebook have come in and, for years, maybe not so much at the moment, but, there was a period there prior and during COVID, obviously, where you had your opportunity to set up your e-commerce business relatively easy on Shopify. And then the media buying piece was quite cheap. I suppose coupled with COVID, everybody was at home. Screen time for everybody went through the roof, which just meant that there was much more eyeballs to kind of go into that auction, and really the cost to acquire customers and that, the cost to actually get in front of a customer was kind of plummeted. And I suppose that a lot of businesses came online for the first time during COVID and were kind of met. It was fantastic that they were able to kind of thrive during COVID and have an online business, but it also brought a lot of people into a world of unrealistic expectations to a certain extent. This unfortunately isn't how e-commerce always works. The ads are a lot cheaper. There is often a lot more competition. And I suppose going to the ROAS piece specifically, most brands we speak to are coming to us and they're still probably looking at ROAS, and it's the main proxy for success with their agency. And why is that being allowed to happen? And I think it has been, just for all the reasons I've kind of just touched on there. For years, the cost to acquire a customer was so low and the efficiency was so good that you didn't really need to take the margin piece into the business as much. It's kind of the boring side of the business. As long as the ad account was optimized properly and your creatives were good, the rest of it took care of itself. The efficiency took care of it. But I suppose as these ad costs have really started to skyrocket in the last couple of years, now you really need to figure out the core unit economics and how that margin plays into your marketing efficiency. And I suppose to really drive a profitable business, you need to be fully dialed in on that boring part of the business that maybe might have been neglected in previous years.
All that silly stuff, exactly. I think one piece maybe to illustrate this is, think about it, a simple way to describe this might be €100 average order value, $100 average order value. If your gross profit and full, after all your cost of goods, product packing, shipping, transaction fees, discounts, returns, and taxes, ultimately, let's say you're left with maybe €60 at the end of the day. Previously, you may have said, okay, well, I don't know exactly how much I'm paying on. I know exactly how much I'm making on a per order basis, but I know after my ad cost, I've something left over in that kind of €40 gap in terms of my margin left. Now, in reality, we would often, chat and give context to users or potential users of StoreHero, and ultimately, it's very difficult to get a clear view of exactly how much you're making on a per order basis with all those costs loaded in. So even in that example, you've a completely different stress level and not only health of the business, but probably health of yourself if your CPA is under that €100 and you can kind of keep under the €100 average order value, or alternatively, it's maybe costing you more. So that difference of, okay, am I profitable on every order or am I not profitable on every order is actually quite difficult to come by. Maybe, Thomas, you can speak to that. Obviously, there's so many pieces in the way between that revenue, which the ROAS is based on, and the actual profit on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one not to get too technical on it, but on the ROAS piece, if you're operating in the EU, obviously the VAT or the tax on the order is included when you sell the product. So if you sell, say for instance, you ran a Google ad or a Facebook ad tomorrow morning and you spent €1 or £1 or whatever it's going to be, Facebook will bill you in Ireland. They bill you for €1.23, so that 23 cents will be added to that. Whereas if you then sold a product for £10, the VAT needs to come out of that. So just be very, very distinct, be clear in understanding that, because you're comparing apples with pears. Let's get past that. I suppose one other piece then, why it's difficult, I suppose, to get down to the profitability pieces. E-com is like, it's not like going into a shop and just purchasing something. There's a ton of different like paper cuts along the way to a certain extent. Obviously, your gross margin is not just your product. You might have your transaction fee. You have the 3PL fee if you're working with somebody to fulfill your orders. You might have a shipping cost. You might have a welcome 10 discount. So by the time you might have given your welcome 10 discount, maybe you've given free shipping if they hit a certain average order value. You have a 3PL fee. Maybe they use Klarna instead of Shopify payments. There's a ton of variable costs that have needed to come out of that, along with your VAT, that all aren't being calculated in ROAS. And I suppose with that in mind, we've just seen it. It's, that in mind with, I suppose, a much murkier world from an attribution perspective. ROAS is kind of on the way out in my perspective. It's still a really, really good proxy in terms of what's working, but if you're looking to kind of gauge success of your paid marketing, it's a terrible metric to really base your business on because it's missing so much of the picture.
Definitely, and we can even give some context as to exactly why that's the case. And this is nobody's fault, by the way. Ultimately, we're operating on the best metrics we can at any given time. There was a time in which we didn't have anything as a revenue basis when we're running Facebook ads or maybe Google ads. We're using number of clicks, we're using CPM, we're using cost per click, whatever the case may be. So we've more to work with. And ultimately, what we're arguing for is that because that's purely on a revenue basis, using pure revenue metrics in an industry known for its complex cost structure is actually going to cause you to run into issues. So maybe just even to speak to maybe some of the reasons why ROAS is good, but maybe it's not perfect. So number one, as we said, it doesn't factor in any order-related costs. So if my ROAS is a 1, therefore I'm getting a 1 times return. That means I've maybe spent, for every €1 I've spent on my advertising, I've gotten €1 back. Now, that's a start, but the cost of the ad itself isn't obviously the only cost in terms of fulfilling that product. You have all those different costs Thomas mentioned, your product fees, your packing, your shipping, transaction fees, discounts, returns, ad spend. And also as well, good ROAS is actually different for everyone. So depending on your own margins, your own setup, both between you and another merchant, or also maybe yourself within your business on different products. Some businesses maybe need a 4x to break even if they've tight margins. For every €1 they spend on ads, they need to drive at least €4 back to factor in all those various costs. Some businesses we've seen are in the 8 figures, doing tens of millions of dollars in revenue, and they're doing so with a ROAS, a return on ad spend of 2. And ultimately, again, using the same from an agency perspective, if you're working with an agency, they'll ultimately just have that one ROAS number. They don't know exactly the point of profitability, the point on a break-even basis, what's actually worth looking at. And the people who understand exactly that point are in a much better position to succeed. Maybe you can speak to that, Thomas.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose really what those brands who are operating that 2 ROAS are probably to an MER perspective more so than a straight ROAS metric. So they're essentially, so MER for anyone who's listening is not familiar with it, is just your net sales divided by your total marketing spend. So again, I wouldn't advise anyone to try and operate their business on a 2 MER basis unless they're fully dialed into exactly what they're doing,
100%.
because there's a rare subset of businesses that can do that, that can scale that. But,
Agreed.
I suppose what we've probably found with the businesses that have got to that level that are using the platform is they're really dialed in operators. They get this stuff. Unit economics is a very, very, I suppose, fluid part of the Monday morning meeting with the founder, with the CMO, with the CFO, or with the agency. So, I mean, if you've gotten to the point where you're fully confident in the data that you have, you're fully understanding that margin infrastructure piece, what you will want to be able to do then is, it's a weird one, because a lot of people think with ROAS or your marketing efficiency, you want to get it as high as possible. But there's a weird balance and a trade-off, which we'll come to in a second, where, you could be overly efficient. That sounds strange, but if, for instance, you're trying to get a 10 return for every euro that you spend or every pound that you spend, would you be better off with a 5 and potentially 10 or 20xing your spend? Probably would be, again, depending on the underlying margin structure of the business. But we can kind of come to that in a minute.
Definitely. And I think John Blair, fractional CFO, a friend of the podcast and a friend of StoreHero, and someone that's really would recommend taking a look at some of his content. He really speaks about that kind of balance between the level of your ad spend and the ROAS you're getting back in return. And it's not a single equation. It's not a case where there's just one ROAS number. Depending on what you spend, your ROAS is going to be completely different. So there's so many combinations in terms of getting where you want to be, but to get to the same revenue, let's say, but ultimately from there you may have a different profitability at the end of it. So we can again come back to that. Before we do so, maybe just to speak from my side, I can touch on some of the key challenges that this actually presents for marketers and agencies. So there's number one, there's a constant battle between the level of spend and ROAS. If, for example, I'm spending €1,000 a day, a week, a month on my paid advertising, and that's giving me a 10x ROAS, as you said, Thomas, ultimately that looks great. The return is as high as possible, but I may actually generate a lot more profit if I spend more at a lower ROAS. So trying to find that balance between exactly what's the sweet spot between level of spend and efficiency is very difficult to do if I'm an agency and I don't actually understand the core unit economics. And agencies often, for that reason, are maybe pressured to keep ROAS as high as possible. So ultimately, people may have been used to getting a ROAS of a certain amount over the last couple of years, and that's not only difficult to maintain, but actually could be doing your business a disservice for a couple of reasons where we can go through in a second.
Just to touch on the distinction between MER there and ROAS, just because people might be getting a small bit confused. Because it maybe explain the two of them and why one may be more valuable than others in certain contexts.
Sure. So ultimately, everyone is going to be very familiar with the challenges around attribution, understanding exactly where each individual sale came from, and ultimately what responsibility or credit each individual ads platform should get. Now, ultimately, with at StoreHero, we have a slightly different methodology than others, and we're ultimately saying nobody knows. So everyone, not everyone, let's say, plenty of people are going to say that they have the secret sauce. They found exactly how to balance the Google and Facebook ROAS, or credit, let's say. And realistically, though, oftentimes I would say that it's not going to be a random startup that's going to solve that problem. If Google and Facebook, let alone a number of other companies, have hundreds of billions of dollars on the line to solve that problem, and they can't solve it. So what we're saying is, well, personally, we're not, and I suppose with Story overall, we're saying we're not getting bogged down in that attribution conversation. We're purely looking at your profitability metrics. So to kind of pull that back to what that means in the context of ROAS and MER, Google will give you a return on ad spend number. Facebook will give you a ROAS, a return on ad spend number. So MER is basically like ROAS for your business overall. So what we're saying there with an MER of 3 is we're saying for every €1 that business overall spends on marketing, the business has generated €3 in overall sales. So as expected, it's a less precise number. It doesn't tell you exactly where the sales came from, but with the understanding that it's such a mishmash anyway, we know, okay, as a business, how efficient is the business overall at turning marketing spend into net sales revenue?
So just to be clear for any operators out there, MER will encapsulate your Klaviyo revenue, any revenue coming from SEO. We're literally taking a whistle-stop tour of all of the revenue in the business divided by any marketing spend that you might be spending. Maybe not just ad spend either. You might want to attribute influencers, or maybe you want to pop in your Klaviyo subscription. Up to you. Every business does this slightly differently, but anything that you're considering a marketing cost. So we're taking net sales divided by total marketing cost. So anything that you consider a marketing cost will be going into that calculation.
Definitely. And maybe just to speak, obviously there is a trade-off there, ultimately between precision as to knowing exactly where each sale is coming from. We're not saying that's not important, but from experience, what we've found across speaking to and auditing hundreds of stores is that most people's problem is they don't have their overall efficiency and as good a place as they could be, or they haven't found that balance, rather than a situation in which they're missing a massive opportunity on one channel. So it's a different conversation to be had, but ultimately, if you can get the fundamental metrics for the business overall correct, we're in a much better position from there. So maybe just to kind of pull that back and kind of go through some practical example of this. We're talking about there that balance between spend and efficiency. We're talking about maybe the limitations of ROAS. It doesn't include all those cost of goods. A good and bad ROAS is different for every brand. So ultimately, it all comes back to that critical point. Well, okay, what's the alternative? Well, if we know there's enough left over from every order, after all those costs are paid and after marketing, everyone is happy. We know we're safely growing the business. So that's contribution margin. So ultimately, contribution margin, this might not be a term you've been familiar with, depending on where in the world you listen to this. But maybe, Thomas, you can give some context on what it is.
If you're not familiar with contribution margin, you clearly haven't followed any content we've done up until this point. But
yeah, everyone else is sick of listening to us about it. You're in the minority.
Yeah, so essentially what contribution margin is your net sales minus the total cost of goods, so product, all those variable costs, and the marketing spend. So I suppose to run a profitable e-com business, what are you trying to do? You're trying to generate as much profit after the marketing spend. And I suppose and you've seen this as well, Karl, is people get scared, and understandably, to kind of really start increasing that ad budget. It's like, oh, you want me to 50% increase my ad budget? How do I know that's going to work? That's a terrifying thing to do as an SME running an e-commerce business. So I suppose what you're trying to do incrementally is slowly increase that spend. And what you're trying to do is, I suppose, monitor the relationship of the ad spend. Okay, so if we increase ad spend by 10%, how has that affected top line sales? That's one thing. Okay, anyone can spend more and generate more top line sales. As long as you've cash to do it, it's not a hard thing to do.
Makes a perfect Shopify screenshot or Klaviyo screenshot or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, you're essentially putting more money into the Facebook jukebox and the music plays louder, and that's fine. But what you're really trying to, I suppose, get to is, how can I spend as much as possible on Facebook or Google and actually generate more profit? So we're not just talking about spending more and generating more revenue. It's spending more and getting more out on the back end in terms of profit. And that is that contribution margin, or some people like to call it just profit after marketing, but before those operating expenses. So again, that's just such an important point that I think most brands and agencies are now starting to really pivot towards, but it's such an important point I think everybody needs to come around to.
Definitely. And even just to underline that point even more so, ultimately, everyone is familiar with all those variable costs. Hopefully you're in a position there where you're understanding your true cost of goods and not just treating your product cost as such. But ultimately, the critical piece and maybe the centerpiece of our approach is saying we want to actually include the cost of marketing as a variable cost. And the reason for that is you could have fantastic gross margins, but if it costs you so much to acquire the customer, it doesn't matter. you could have you could have 80% gross margins, but if it costs you that, if that 80% is spent to acquire the customer versus maybe 40% to acquire the customer, you're in a completely different world. So if we know ultimately, anytime we spend an extra euro or an extra €100, if that's going to drive more profit after marketing spend, so therefore my overall profit is going up as well as my revenue, then I'm going to be inclined to spend more. If it doesn't, I'll spend less. And ultimately, that maybe opens up a really interesting exercise we can run through just to show an example as to how you increase spend and what that does to that profit after marketing cost. So just to share my screen, Thomas, maybe you can run through this.
Okay, so what we're looking to figure out here, I suppose, is the relationship between spend, return on ad spend, and actually the contribution margin on the back end of it as well. So let's look at the very, very first line, I suppose, initially. So we can see that the business spent $10,000 at a ROAS. So for every dollar that they spent, they generated $750. So the revenue on that is 75K, gross margin of 45 after we take out the cost of goods. And then obviously the profit on the back end of that is 35. So as we can see, as we spend more on the left-hand side here, for instance, the spend goes from 10K to 50K. The revenue generated, so we're anytime you spend more on Facebook, often you spend more, but you'll do well to hold on to the efficiency. So, initially we're spending 10K at a 750 ROAS, but maybe when we increase that to 50K, we can't expect to continue to have that 650 ROAS. So that's 750 ROAS. So let's say that we lose a bit of efficiency, but we increase spend from 10K to 50K. Then our revenue maxes out there at 325. So what I suppose when you're looking at contribution margin, what you're trying to figure out is what's the point at which I can spend the most amount of money to generate the most profit here, contribution margin on the back end. So what this business has figured out is that when they spend 100K, the ROAS comes down to 5. Yes, that caps out at 500K in revenue, and the profit after marketing, our contribution margin, is 200K in the back end. Now, where I think this is interesting, and a lot of brands tend to maybe fall down sometimes, is they might have got to that 75K mark there at a 5.75 ROAS, and maybe the brand said, okay, let's stop there. We need to kind of keep that volume, that piece of efficiency there. Okay, yes, you would have lost out on the upside of the revenue. We've gone from 431 to 500, but has it been a worthwhile venture for the business? And, as we can see there, it has been. So not only has the spend gone up from 75K to 100, the revenue has gone up by, call it 70K, but the profit out on the back end of it is up by what? About 17K there as well. We've gone from 183K up to the 200 mark. And I'll just finish on this as well. So once we go down to the next line there, we can see the business then up the spend on a monthly basis to 125K. That degradation of the efficiency. So we went from a 5 ROAS down to a 4.25. And yes, the revenue did go up. It went up from 500K up to 531. So, what you might be thinking there is, okay, you spent 25 extra K on marketing, and the revenue went up by 31. Fantastic. Well, no, not fantastic, because you need to take the margin into the account there. So what we can see is, yes, we spent more. We spent 125 at a 4.25 ROAS. The revenue went up to 531K, but actually the profit on the back end went down. The profit on the back end went from 200K down to 193, which means even though the revenue went up, it actually wasn't a worthwhile venture for the business because the profit after the marketing spend actually dipped.
Definitely. And you can anyone maybe listening, again, you're going to need to be looking at this table to get the finer details. Don't worry, it's on the Spotify video as well. But you can manage plotting this out as a curve. So there's a kind of a point of diminishing marginal returns, or what we would more simply call your sweet spot. How far can you push your paid advertising before you're actually digging yourself into a hole and you're going backwards? So everyone wants to do that. They want to maximize their potential as a brand and maximize the potential of their clients' ad accounts. And ultimately, contribution margin answers that question. The critical thing to highlight here is if you're just purely using ROAS as an indicator, and you say, for example, go from spending 10K at a 7.50 ROAS to up to 50K and spend a 6.5 or 75 at a 5.75, you may look at that and say, okay, well, my ROAS is going down, that's bad, I need to stop. But you actually may be missing an opportunity to earn more profit. And ultimately, that's not only important in order to take advantage and maximize the the upside and the potential there as a business, but you may have other operational expenses that if you can drive more profit, you can more easily absorb them. So that's something that's really worth kind of keeping in mind and taking into account as well.
Yeah, and I mean it's such an interesting piece, and I suppose I just want to be very clear in highlighting that the increments there. Do you want to just share the screen very quickly again there?
I'll pull it back up. Yeah.
So the increments at which I suppose the as you spend more, we've plotted a degradation kind of curve on the efficiency. So what I mean by that is, the increase we've plotted spend at 100K at a 5 ROAS and spend at 125 at a 4.25 ROAS. So as you spend more, you've become a little bit less efficient on the marketing spend. That understanding the dynamic between more spend and less efficiency is quite complex, and it's often where people can tend to fall down. The rate at which that degrades will be very, very different for every brand, and it's just been very clear and deliberate about making sure that we kind of be very clear on that, I suppose, because understanding that as you spend more, yes, your marketing will generally become less efficient, but it's about getting the balance between how the volume of the spend versus the efficiency at which we're still profitable, and how can we maximize that profitability on the back end of it.
Definitely. Maybe just to summarize there as well, again, the main question we're trying to answer here with all these different metrics is, if I spend an extra €100 with an extra $100, an extra £100, does it give me more profit after my marketing cost? If it does, we'll continue to spend, and we haven't hit the top of this curve we just outlined. If we spend more and our contribution margin goes down, we've ultimately hit our ceiling. But okay, that doesn't mean there's nothing more to do. Let's raise our ceiling. Let's look at, how can we improve the content of our advertising? How to improve maybe our website? Maybe it's a product offering piece. Maybe it's the branding. Maybe it's improved retention on the back end, or kind of average order value, let's say, that we can retain, customers later on, maybe better quality customers or something like that. Again, plenty of different kind of avenues to explore there, but that's the critical piece. Yeah.
I might just share my screen there if that's okay, just for a very quick second. We might actually just look at a store that gave me the okay to have a look at this earlier today. I mentioned we'd be chatting about this. So just to kind of highlight that point. So we're kind of touching on, increasing spend, maybe your efficiency falls, but maybe the profit on the back end is actually worth it, So, this business last year, ad spend increased by over 260%. So, I mean, looking at it year on year, huge spike there on ad spend year over year. Marketing efficiency, so your MER. So looking at that, it's your net sales divided by total marketing spend. So they actually generated 56% less marketing efficiency year over year. Now 7.59 is still very, very healthy. So look at that. Like, that would be a lot of brand owners' nightmare. The efficiency has fallen dramatically over year as they've looked to increase spend. So thinking about those two things in tandem, like, we're spending way more and our efficiency's gone through the floor. That shouldn't make any sense. But really what you're trying to do is get to understand the underlying margin structure of the business. And yes, we've spent a hell of a lot more and the marketing is down. But look, that contribution margin, the profit out on the back end of it, has actually increased by 18%. So if this business had been kind of, I suppose, too hung up on achieving a really efficient ROAS, or that a really efficient marketing efficiency piece, they mightn't have spent as heavily to maintain the overall efficiency, but that actually would have cost them money. So what they would have done to actually maybe save money or try to make the business more profitable, kind of weirdly actually might have cost them a lot of profit in the back end. So that they increased contribution margin on the back end here, despite a massive uptake in their advertising spend. Contribution margin went up by 18%, which is about, back at the napkin maths here, about 90K increase, which they had then to cover the operational expenses of the business. So the net profit of the business just soared as a result of, I suppose a mindset shift that they were going to use this contribution margin, profit after marketing piece as, I suppose, the North Star in which to run the business.
Definitely. I'm going to rob one of the lines that you've said, and I've heard you say, but e-commerce is often a financial game masquerading as a marketing game. And on that basis, these numbers are so important. People haven't had to look as closely. And again, it's nobody's fault. It's just the economic environment in which we were operating, the kind of marketing landscape in which we were operating. But as a key takeaway, what are the metrics you're using on a daily basis to run your business? Are they revenue-based metrics that look at that overarching sales? Okay, fine, it'll get you a certain way. But is there an opportunity to replace them with profit-focused metrics, whether it's contribution margin, look at lifetime value, how much profit on a profit basis, what profit are you generating from customers over time. You're going to sleep better at night. You're going to have a much clearer view of the health of your business, and you'll really understand the Goldilocks zone, that sweet spot for growth. Anything to finish up on, Thomas?
No, I mean, if you're listening to this podcast and you're operating an agency, or you're operating a brand, we're definitely not saying you need to go and become a CPA or become an accountant by any stretch of the imagination.
Very true.
But having the ability to read a P&L to some extent, having the ability to understand what unit economics are, like, this is going to be the most important shift, I think, in e-com over the next 5-10 years, is being able to really map that kind of intersection between marketing and finance to a certain extent. I just can't understate how important I think that's going to be over the next couple of years as well. So that's probably the only thing I'd finish on there.
Definitely. I suppose just as a final takeaway, there's a couple of benefits to this profit first view that we would see for both agencies and teams. So as we can see there, you can actually get better results, drive more profitable business, and have maybe happier clients or a boss if you're on either the agency side or in-house with a lower ROAS. So more profitable with a lower ROAS. Again, that sounds interesting. Time is money, so quicker to ultimately see what's working and what isn't. You're not trying to balance those different sides of the coin and that seesaw between spend and efficiency. As a kind of an agency, your clients feel like, okay, you understand their business. You're looking at things in a deeper way. And as agencies have become such a fragmented, or I suppose a competitive space with low barriers to entry, it's the reason why I started an agency, and I'm sure a lot of agency owners did. They were able to put their foot in and take that first step. But if everyone else can do the same, then you need to be able to effectively differentiate yourself. And again, as a lasting point, you have more confidence and clarity when raising ad budgets. There's only so many hours in the day, and if we can do so, take action on our brands, either on our client accounts, with a clearer view of the future and a clearer view of success, we're in a much better position. So thanks everyone for listening. We'll be back again. Plenty of really interesting podcasts coming up. Maybe Thomas, if you wanted to touch on some of the interviews we have coming up over the next week or two.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have David Lockwood from Tapestry Agency in London coming on to chat about all things incrementality. And we also have Michael Epstein of Postpilot coming on to tell us about their growth story over the last couple of years, which is a fantastic episode. Michael has a really, really interesting background that I think a lot of people will get interest from.
Fantastic. Looking forward to it. Thanks, everyone.